Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Amberjack webinar looking back at the 2024-25 early career campaign year and looking at what it has taught us about early careers assessment and selection processes. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Martin Kavanagh. I am a chartered psychologist and head of assessment at Amberjack. In the next hour, I've split it into about 40 minutes of, to be honest, me talking at you and sharing lots of what I think, and hopefully you'll also think is really, really interesting data to share as we go through. There'll be 20 minutes at the end of the session for carrying on the discussion, questions and answers. Please do add any questions that you have throughout the session using the chat. My colleague Jasmine will be monitoring the chat and we'll be able to pass on any questions that we're getting throughout the session at the end. Do use the chat function rather than the appealing looking Q&A function, because I'm afraid that isn't operational for this session. The session will be recorded and everyone always asks, yes, the slides will be available. They will be sent through to you as part of the follow-up activity. So I won't go into too much detail about who Amberjack are. You're on this webinar, which is an Amberjack hosted webinar, so I assume you know a little bit about us. But what I did want to go into is how I've sort of defined, since I joined Amberjack 3 years ago, the key principles that set our assessments aside. So first of all, we assess for potential. So we believe you should be assessing in a way that doesn't favour experience or privilege. It genuinely identifies the candidates who have genuine potential and are going to add huge amounts of value to organisations. We see assessment as an extension of attraction, so we want candidates to learn about the organisation they're joining through the assessment process. But more importantly, perhaps, we want them to think, if this much care has gone into a really high quality assessment process, just imagine how much care is going to go on to my development. And also, importantly, Amberjack are a genuine end-to-end provider of early careers talent solutions. So we do everything right from attraction right through to onboarding candidates and then managing their learning and development whilst they're on scheme on behalf of our clients. And so there will be, as part of this, there'll be a series of webinars looking at and deep diving into our assessment services, and we will be focusing on each one of those. But today I wanted to focus in on the end-to-end provision. And just to give you a little bit more information about this, I've worked in different assessment providers, and where we haven't had the full end-to-end service, so perhaps we've just been responsible for the online psychometric assessment side of things, we haven't done the attraction, we haven't done the assessment centre design. It's a very different discussion when we get to a review of a process and the end of campaign, because it's possible for us to say, well, the data on our part of the process doesn't look great, but that's probably because of something that's happening in the attraction. It might be something that's happening in the design of your assessment centre. At Amberjack, and this is a great thing, we don't have that luxury. We're responsible for everything. We need to be across everything. We need to understand, we need to be able to look at data and understand what's happening and make recommendations as a result. Because we host everything in our own technology and we do the end-to-end, we have access to unbelievable levels of data, which means we're able to run sessions like this where we share insights that can help organizations develop their assessment and selection processes. So what are we looking to achieve today? So the main objective, and I am afraid it is quite a selfish one, is there are certain questions that I'm really interested in. So in preparing for this webinar, I was like, well, let's look at all of the data that we've just crunched as we've been doing our end of campaigns with clients, and I want to do a really selfish review of this data to understand some of the questions that I perhaps haven't been able to answer and have wanted to answer. Throughout the session, you can pose your own questions that you're interested in. If we've got the data and answers to hand, we'll answer them at the end of the session. But it might be that it's a challenge for me and the team to go away, use our data and show how we can use the benchmark data that we've got available to help you with the questions you're interested in. And this will allow you ideally to provide benchmarks to compare the performance of your processes, either by saying, okay, our before our performance was better than that, or challenged in that area. Or maybe you don't collect the data and it's going to get you thinking about how you can collect more data to understand how your process is working. And I'm just going to close off the session by reflecting on the future of early careers assessments, tying up everything that I have been talking about through the session. So a couple of quick context bits to help you understand some of the terminology used, and apologies if anyone's on the call and they feel patronized by being called a small early careers employer, but we do have to categorize different groups into different ways to help give meaning to the analysis. So what I've done is I've said defined any large early career employers as those getting between 5,000 and 30,000 applications per year, a medium employer as those getting between 1,000 and 5,000, and the small employers are those that receive less than 1,000 per year. And typically, the large early career employers will use completely bespoke assessment frameworks that are designed for their organization and tools that are specifically designed for their campaigns. The small early career employers will typically use the Amberjack future potential model, which is an off-the-shelf potential model ready to go, which is designed to assess for potential in early career markets, which is very quick and easy to deploy with a suite of assessments mapped to it. The medium employers would have a bit of a mixture of the both. So they might have their own assessment framework and use some of our items, but we would identify the items that are most suitable for their needs. So it's a bit of a hybrid approach. And where possible, I have looked into and focused on campaigns that have worked with us over 2 years with minimal changes to their assessment processes and materials, so we can meaningfully look at year-on-year data changes. The final bit of context is Amberjack's typical candidate journey, because this will help explain some of the terms I'm using. So typically in our process, candidates complete an application form where they provide minimal requirements as the essential requirements for the role, and we make sure that they meet those requirements. If they do, they move into our online blended assessment experience. They complete all aspects of this assessment in one sitting, but it is made up of 2 sort of distinct sections for scoring purposes. There's a section which is auto-scored, where there's absolutely correct answers, situational judgment items, applied intellect items, for example, and they are scored automatically in our technology. There's also a video assessment section, or a manually scored section, which is typically video assessment, where human screeners will score responses provided by the candidate. So if we're talking about auto-scored versus manually scored, that's the distinction there. Typically, a overall total score is produced from the assessment, and that is used to inform which candidates move through to an assessment centre, which is hosted in our technology and often designed by the Amberjack assessment team. So the first question that I'm interested in, and something that is coming up in every event, is people are saying their biggest challenge is dealing with the significant numbers that are coming into the process. And what's cited here is the perfect storm of the rapid adoption of generative AI, making applications much easier, a smaller number of graduate programs, meaning more competition in the roles that they are applying for, and also, it continues to be the case that there's less of the issue that would have been in the past, where candidates have to live near the headquarters that they're working at. Obviously, everything that was loosened up over COVID and continues to be is meaning much more geographical location. So it does suggest it's the sort of a rich environment for increasing application numbers. But let's have a look at what we actually see year on year. So the headline figure here is that across our campaigns, there's been on average a 20% increase in applications, but it does differ by client and it differs by size of client. So in the large clients, for example, we're seeing a big difference between one which has almost doubled in application numbers, one which has gone up by 27%, and one which has actually gone down. Now, the 2 that have gone up rapidly are in industries that I would say are much more future-proofed and would be seen as longer term safer bets, I suppose, perhaps playing into some anxieties about the future of roles that might be in the sector. And similar, I think that you're seeing a general increase. Medium clients are seeing the biggest increase. What is happening there is there's this the bit of this creep where people who would have favored those really large graduate roles are seeing the level of competition and I suppose widening their net and moving down to perhaps organizations that they would have wanted to go to larger ones previously, but they are now doing that because of the increased competition. Interestingly, the small cap clients have actually gone down on average. So a 14% reduction in the number of candidates that are applying to them. So that again, that could be the sort of, do you see the larger and medium employers as a safer bet? Are they a safer organization to apply for? Or perhaps there's just a general assumption that application numbers are going up, so there's less need to put focus into attraction opportunities. But I think there's a real opportunity for the smaller employers, perhaps taking advantage of this creep I was talking about to make sure that they're selling their organizations in the right way and potentially attracting applicants that they might not have been able to attract before. So just as a sort of summary of this, the application increase is absolutely real, but I would say it's more nuanced and needs a more nuanced response than perhaps what we're seeing at industry events. So the challenges for those really large employers are going to be very different for those smaller employers. A question I've had more conversations about than anything else this season is what impact is generative AI having? And just as recently as yesterday, there was a very strong message on LinkedIn saying, some of the more the types of assessment that are built into our auto-scored elements can be gamed by generative AI, won't work because you just put it into a generative AI system and it will do it all for you. Well, I think we're at a point now where there is widespread adoption of generative AI and it is massively increased over the last couple of years, but certainly in the last year. So what is it looking like in the data? So let's first of all look at our auto scored data. So this is those situational judgment and applied intellect items. And you'll see quite clearly on this graph, we're not seeing that issue that is being said is a really clear issue. So the things I was interested in is there an increase in the average score, which is it stayed almost identical? Is there a general move to a more positive scores? Or is there any spikes that you wouldn't expect to see? So perhaps a spike right at the top end of the scale because people are using quite premium versions of generative AI and getting advantages for it. We're not seeing any of that. Our auto scored data is holding up. So either the impact of or the ability of generative AI to game these types of assessments is being overstated, or candidates aren't using it to game assessments. We're seeing very, very similar patterns in our medium clients. So here's an example from one of our medium clients. Very, very similar average score across the boards. And likewise in the smaller client, this has gone up. The auto score has gone up. So we have been monitoring this quite closely. It's not gone up significantly. And that is the nature of the smaller campaigns, that they're more open to fluctuations due to the numbers completing. Let's move on to the manual score element now, and let's look at the particularly focused on video interviews. I'll ask the sort of impact of AI on video interviews. Now, before I show you the year-on-year data, we have been working with some of our clients to really closely monitor what we would identify as suspicious behavior. So all of our manual scored elements are scored by human assessors who are trained on the specific campaigns and calibrated against the Amberjack standards. And what we're finding, and there's academic research that suggests this is absolutely the case, is it is quite easy to spot if a candidate is overly reliant on generative AI. So it varies how many candidates are being flagged as clearly using generative AI to generate their response. That variation is caused by how strict our clients are. So if the client is saying, we don't want anyone reading off a script, that is the most strict end of the spectrum. And when they do that and say report anyone that looks like they're reading off a script, that would be about 10% of the candidates that we're seeing from our monitoring. At the other end of the spectrum, it might be we only want to know about the people who are verbatim copying something that you've identified when you've put your items through the generative AI technology, and it's clearly using the same methodology. So that's a useful bit of context. We go into the manual score. Now this is interesting data. So this is for one of our large clients. Ignore that massive peak on the 8th. There's a difference in how this client is scoring, which explains that. That isn't anything to do with how the candidates are reporting. But what I was interested in is this large spike appearing at the score of 12, which would typically be sort of, getting towards that sort of mid-range. Interestingly, it probably wouldn't be good enough to progress to the assessment centre for a very large client because of the volumes that you have to screen out at this stage. But a passable score on most benchmarks. So that is interesting that a peak is appearing at that level of 12. So a bit of a different picture to the auto score, a little bit less confidence that there isn't specific behaviour in the video interview that we should be questioning. Interestingly, though, the average score here, whilst it's not a huge difference, it has actually gone down. So it is potentially saying that if candidates are using it to complete the video interview, maybe they could be performing better if they actually use their own responses. Similarly, with the medium-sized clients, we are seeing a bit of a peak in the middle range that we didn't see last year. So something to keep monitoring and keep thinking about with our assessors. I've seen a question about how we train the assessors and how we score video interviews has come up. So I'll cover that off at the Q&A session at the end. Okay, so the other thing we're interested in, so it's not just about spread of scores. What we're interested in is, are the assessments still doing what they need to do? Now, one of the things that we provide as standard in our process to our clients, which provides really interesting data, is the predictive validity throughout the process. Now, ideally, we'd be getting predictive validity of, well, how do people score in our assessments and how do they go on to perform in role? That takes time to do, and it is very difficult to get that data from the clients. It also is quite difficult because you only get a very small sample of people who end up in role. So without being able to do that with most of our clients, what we do is we look at how predictive validity holds up through the process. So what you'd expect, if you're funneling people out based on the auto score only and saying, well, we don't want to review their manual score because they got below a benchmark on the auto score, you want to be confident that those are the people who are going to do better in the manual scored element. So you look at the extent to which the auto score predicts the manually scored element. And what we're seeing here is a mixed bag. So it looks like the auto score to manual score, the validity we're looking at the change in validity rather than the overall validity from 2024 to 2025. So in half of the clients we looked at, the validity actually went up. In half of them, it went down. If we then look at the auto score to assessment centre total, again, a mixed bag. So the extent to which just the auto score items alone would predict in the assessment centre. Similarly for manual score to AC total. But interestingly, and the most important score in our assessment is the total score, because we believe in blended assessment. When you look at the overall score, which is the combination of auto score and manual score, across 5 of the 7 clients we looked at this data for, we were seeing an increase in the predictive power of the blended assessment in identifying the top performers at the assessment centre. So if there was a real problem in generative AI being able to completely mask performance across assessment processes, you would start to see in quite a systematic way this link between score on the online assessment and assessment centre to degrade. That's not what we're seeing in our data. So in terms of what impact is generative AI having? Based on the data that we've looked at the moment, the rapid adoption of AI isn't having a noticeable impact on the spread of auto-scored elements of our assessment. The manual scored data is more open to debate, and we do continue to monitor that and look at ways we can automatically flag when people are using a generative AI in an appropriate way, for example, in video interviews. The next one linking to this is which assessment methods are most predictive. So we were looking at our typical flow here and looking at the assessments we use. So this looks at the overall predictive validity data when you look at what happens between auto score and manual score, auto score and assessment center total, manual score and assessment center total, and total score on the assessment, online assessment and assessment center total. Now, what is worth saying is we've also crunched this data with assessment providers who we host the data for, but we don't provide the assessments. So we've seen the data, and our assessments perform favorably in terms of the predictive validity rates we're showing as they go through the process. So I know some of you might be saying, well, you're only showing us Amberjack data. I'm only presenting Amberjack data. We have looked at how these rates compare with some of our sort of competitors in the market. So there are a couple of outliers here. So the auto score to assessment center total for the small clients is a little bit of an outlier. Likewise, the manual score to assessment center total for the medium-sized clients. But what we are seeing is a fairly consistent picture where the total score, so the combination of the manual score and the auto score, is the most predictive of assessment center total. Now, that is quite important to think about because I still see a lot of campaigns where a number of different assessments are taken in what I call a hurdled approach. So you complete one assessment and then you score it and you decide who to progress on to the next one, complete another assessment, score it, and so on and so on. The fact we collect multiple data points at the same time is resulting in probably that result in the incremental validity going up. So the total score being more powerful, obviously, than the individual parts of the assessment. I also think there's an issue with processes where a huge amount of the decision on who to progress is based on the auto score elements of the assessment, because I think it's that combination of the auto scored elements and the manually scored. So how do they interact? Or sometimes our manually scored assessments are sort of case study type exercises, seeing that more work relevant assessment rather than a sort of definitely helps on that side of things. So in terms of which assessment methods are most predictive, again, the rapid adoption of AI isn't having a consistent impact on the predictive validity of our assessments. There were fluctuations, which we've looked at on a case-by-case basis, but it isn't a case of all of the predictive validity ratios coming down. But typically, and this is something we've advocated for a long time, blended multi-criterion assessments are the most predictive way to assess early career talent. So the next one is a net promoter score of plus 23 any good? So this is quite a technical question. What this is getting at really is what is a good candidate experience? And the reason I've phrased it as a net promoter score question, for those who aren't aware, is that net promoter score is a scale that goes from minus 100 up to 100. It's a question that started off in retail, which was around, based on your experience, would you recommend this organization to your families and friends? So that has been used quite widely in various areas, including in recruitment, to look at what candidates are saying about a process. So the scale is managed so that essentially any score above 0, you've got more people being positive about your experience than otherwise, and overall people are going to be very positive about your program and campaign. If it's below 0, then you've got a bit of an issue, and it would be seen based on that benchmark as being problematic. So what are we seeing in our data, again, broken down by the large, medium and small clients? So let's start off with the blue dots, which are the blended assessment net promoter scores. So what you're seeing here is a difference where, as the sort of the campaigns get larger, the net promoter score goes up. So the small campaigns have the lowest net promoter score. Now this will be because the medium and large campaigns put a lot more effort into bespoking their assessments, making them specific for the organizations that they're applying for. If you apply to a small scheme and you complete one of our off-the-shelf assessments, there is the risk of feeling a little bit more like just one of the numbers. So that 41.5 is still good, but a good way to increase engagement and again create that feeling of being cared for is to use more bespoke content in the blended assessment. Interestingly, we see the reverse happening with the assessment centre. So the green dots are the average NPS assessment centre score. So generally, the smaller clients perform better at the assessment centre in terms of candidate engagement. And when we looked at the comments that supported these statements, there was definitely the feel of more care, more attention going in. And perhaps that's because the smaller employers have more time to think about this and less people to transact. But the candidates were talking about how fluid the day was, how well briefed the assessors were. Again, there's going to be a tighter pool of assessors. As we got into the larger ones, there was talk about, well, we wanted more of a chance to network, to understand more about the roles. We wanted better briefed assessors because my assessor didn't feel that well briefed. So issues that come up with the size. So rather than what the materials are like and how well tailored they are to the role, it's the actual experience and how much care they're given, which is driving the difference in net promoter score in the assessment centre areas. So if you collect net promoter score, or you're interested in collecting it going forward based on this discussion, a couple of benchmarks that I typically use and we use to sort of rag status our clients is over plus 50 on the online assessment is a very strong NPS, and then over plus 80 on the assessment centre is very strong. Obviously, given our assessment as an extension of attraction vision, we hold ourselves to pretty high standards. So there might be a different benchmark for you. I'm very happy to provide more data about what the overall trends are looking like on it on NPS. Okay, the next question, which comes up a lot, is so we do use video interviews, and people often say, well, candidates hate video interviews, or do candidates hate video interviews? And there is a widely held view that video interviews are very unpopular. So let's look at the data on this. So to do this, we took the net promoter score again, but we also looked at completion rates for clients who use video interview as part of their blended assessment, and also have a version of the assessment where they've taken the video interview out. So a really pure like for like comparison. So looking at our first example, the blended assessment with the video interview has a completion rate of 95% and a net promoter score of 60.65. Without the video interview, the completion rate goes up, but the net promoter score comes down. So, an immediate question is, do candidates hate it? Well, we're saying when there's a video interview in there as well, candidates are responding more positively to the net promoter score question. Some people might say, well, the completion rate is an issue. There is academic research that shows that actually, if you're losing candidates through the process, the academics looked at the quality of the candidates you're losing, and what they found is they were the people that were less likely to have a good environmental fit, a values fit with the organisation, and also less likely to succeed in the role. So what could be happening here is as simple as it's nothing to do with the video interview, but actually it's just a longer assessment. So there's a smaller completion rate. And the net promoter score, conversely, I would hypothesize that that's because the candidates feel that more data is being collected and a more holistic view of their performance is being gathered by the employer. We don't have any net promoter score in this second example, so it's just completion rates, but actually the very similar completion rates when there was the video interview included and when the video interview wasn't. The other comparison I was really interested in is we do have clients who build the video interview into their blended assessment, but also have the video interview as a standalone for their less popular schemes. So they just go straight into the video interview in effect. They don't need the auto-scored elements of the assessment. So let's look at what's happening here. So with the video interview and the blended assessment, we're seeing that quite consistent mid to high 90s completion rate, a very high net promoter score. This client had produced a very, very bespoke, branded, very high spec online assessment. So that could explain why that's higher than in some of the areas. The video interview only had a higher completion rate and a net promoter and a lower net promoter score. So we're seeing a familiar pattern. So is this issue with the video interviews completion rates? Is it more when it's part of a longer process rather than being the video interview in itself? So in terms of a conclusion, based on the data I showed, I'm going to stop short of saying candidates don't dislike video interviews. They might dislike video interviews, but our data is suggesting it's not enough to put them off completing. It is worth saying we do a lot, again, thinking about the end-to-end process, we do a lot to encourage people to complete, and we're more and more using AI-enabled tools to do that and encourage completions. So maybe that is part of it, how we encourage our candidates and create that process that they want to be part of. But as a high-level question, I'm not seeing huge concerns around the video interview. I do note, though, it would be good to do more analysis at the demographic levels. I know that there have been points made that it may disproportionately put off specific groups of candidates, which obviously we absolutely have to avoid happening. In terms of which assessment methods are most effective for high volumes, we've spoken about the blended nature of assessments, but I just wanted to talk about this quite interesting finding. So we're now not looking at large, medium and small employers. We're looking at whether the assessments are fully bespoke, fully off the shelf, or a mixture. And the key takeaway, we're seeing a similar pattern to what I showed earlier, but the key takeaway is predictive validity, so the extent to which each stage predicts the next stage, almost completely drops off when there's a mix of off-the-shelf and bespoke methods used. And the logic behind this is if you're using consistently off-the-shelf methods, you're consistently assessing against the Amberjack future potential model. Each stage of the process, you're assessing against that same model. If you're going down the bespoke route, you're building an assessment that is mapped to an organization's framework. But actually, if you're using a mixture of the two, you will be jumping between different assessment frameworks, and this data is suggesting that actually causes the predictive validity to drop off. So I've already said a number of times, in our view, the more blended, the better, and that's what the data is showing. But that consistency in design does matter. The overall decision on shortlisting, I would encourage you to use as many data points as you can rather than use the latest stage of the process as the sole decision-making point. So shortlisting based on total score is better than shortlisting based on individual elements of the process. The final area I'm always asked about and always interested in is, are organizations doing virtual or in-person assessments? Now, this is at the final stage of the process, and does it impact quality? So I'm going to lean on, every year we do an insights data gathering exercise, both from candidates and our clients, to understand, and organizations in early careers to understand what they're doing. So this is helpful data in terms of benchmarking and seeing what's happening. So around the same amount are doing in-person and virtual assessment centres. And around the same amount, so 26% in total, are mix and matching. So either in person or virtually by default, but candidates can select if that mode doesn't work for them. So I get the logic of that. I understand, and I've heard people make very convincing cases for why they should be doing that for social mobility. Perhaps people can't, get away from their work requirements, caring requirements to get to an in-person assessment centre. So we'll let them complete it virtually. There is data, though, that does suggest that applicants in virtual settings are scored lower than in face-to-face settings. So in terms of this question, I haven't yet been able to answer. It's something that myself and the team are looking to do for our data. Haven't been able to answer the extent to which the quality of your assessing improves virtual versus in person. But what I am able to say is it's around 50-50 between virtual and in person still. And more work is needed to look at the impact of quality, but consistency is the key. So how you assess, you should be assessing all of your candidates through one mode. Okay, I'm just gonna wrap up now with a little bit of a discussion about what this means for us, and the future of assessment. So the more blended, the better. I've said it a number of times, but what we're seeing in the data is that combination of different areas. Even if as a standalone, it doesn't have the best predictive power. When it's added into a wider assessment, it can have quite a big impact in terms of adding additional information to your decision-making process. So we are in the process of building the Amberjack personality questionnaire, among other different assessment types. I do have some concerns which we're working through with using personality questionnaires for early career talent. How formulated is their view of what their personality is? How much does it build from the point at which they join an organization through their first 5 or 6 years? But what we are doing is we're trying to build a personality questionnaire that is assessing for potential from first principles, that deals with those issues. We've got a version that we're using for developmental purposes very successfully. It provides norm referenced scores against each of the areas of our future potential assessment and leads to really powerful coaching conversations. We are also looking into different AI based measures that could be built into our blended assessment approach to further increase that predictive validity. Assessing AI skills is a big topic that everyone's talking about. So do we need to understand how well our future potential uses AI? Now, I just come back to where I started at the start. We don't want to favor certain experiences or privileges. So it might be that if we build an assessment, we're just favoring people who've spent the most time using generative AI rather than people who've got the aptitude to learn it. So what we're looking at is what are the behaviors that relate to this, and almost a competency model for assessing AI skills. So you're interested in how people use AI ethically, how the quality of their prompting, their systems thinking, and their continuous improvement. So we've looked at ways to build this into the auto-scored part of our blended assessment, but of more interest to me is how do we go beyond that? So there's not just what prompt would you use? Is this the right prompt to use in that situation? But how do you look at how someone interacts with AI and understand the behavioral side of it? So how curious they are, how much they question what they're receiving, how well they use it and think about what they're doing. So you can see me here in a prototype that we're looking at, which is me interacting with generative AI solutions, and thinking about, well, how do I respond to a follow-up question asking me why I used that prompt, and that's what we're looking at. And ideally we'll get to a place where this will be able to be scored through AI. So we continue to build on the power of potential. This will be launched in one of my other sessions, looking at a deep dive into assessment, but we have been evolving our future potential model based on all of our learnings from this year, and how we assess general potential in early career talent. So very happy to pick up that conversation further. And then finally, thinking about AI again, we are very, very conscious of how we safely introduce AI. So candidates prefer currently when they're told that their assessment is manually scored by a human. And in particular at Amberjack, we've got a very, very robust quality assurance process that means anyone manually scoring has gone through a very detailed process. So first of all, we think carefully about who we resource onto a project. We train them on the exact campaign that they're assessing against. There's a calibration session where everyone's scoring in that session is all scoring against the same frame of reference and making sure that there's good consistency. And then based on that, we then set a few candidates to assess, and we closely quality assure it from the assessment team to make sure we're happy with the scores that are being provided before they go into the live process. That is what we need to create in any AI scoring that we do. In any, that rigor needs to go into any AI sort of augmented processes that we do. So we're absolutely focused on how do we do human controlled AI augmented processes that will build on some of the data that I've already shared. So that's everything I wanted to take you through. Managed time very well there. So it's about 40 minutes of me talking. Hopefully that didn't get too technical at different points and all made sense. My details are on the screen if you want to connect or continue the discussion further. But I will hand over to Jazz to see what's coming through on the comments and Q&A.
We had one question come in. So for anybody who'd like to add into the chat, now is the time. But I think you picked up on this when it came through from Debbie, who said, for the video interview and identification of the candidates using AI, are these mostly pre-recorded video interviews or are they live interviews?
Yeah, they're pre-recorded, so they receive the question and they have a period of time to respond to it. But again, thinking about the differences and assessment as an extension of attraction, it is very engaging. So a lot of our clients will have the video question presented with perhaps a current graduate presenting it, or a little bit of a sort of interesting video about what that organization does as it flows into the video interview question, and then it's presented to the candidate. That's right.
Thank you very much. And then just a comment, which I did also think you started to cover at one point, but Phil said demographic and diversity analysis is key on top of the great analysis here to provide a full review. So yeah,
absolutely, and we do have that. So very happy to as I said, is there any questions that people are particularly interested in? It would be a really interesting challenge for me and my team. So if you say, well, is there a higher dropout in let's say, is there a higher dropout in neurodiverse candidates from a video interview? That is something that we could do analysis of. I mean, obviously in an hour's session, what do we want to provide? So let's carry on the conversation. If there's any particular areas of interest, we can have a look at that using our data.
We've just had another question come in from Eric, who said, what about candidates who use Gen AI to answer video interviews? How do you score that? And is that encouraged?
It's very different client by client. So there are some, I mean, the key thing is, however you're going to use that, it needs to be communicated to candidates up front. So there are clients, so for example, it's typically in sort of sales roles, consultancy type roles, where what they would say is, well, we want someone who's able to, even if it's, presented from generative AI, we want someone who will be able to present that in an interesting and engaging way. So they will say up front, we want to hear from you. We don't want to see overly scripted responses. So in that case, they say, when it's being manually reviewed, if it's clearly overly scripted and it's on the scoring criteria, that person is flagged. If it's obviously scripted, they are removed from the process. And if there's a bit, if there's a bit of a discussion needed to be had, that happens on a candidate by candidate basis.
And another question from Kaz. We've all been doing in-tray, SJT, or similar for a while. What's next from a task perspective? To reframe, what are some of the more engaging tasks that you've involved within ACs lately?
So, well, that's a really good question. I mean, first of all, some of the AI potential is so exciting for what we do. So, one of my team shared with me a new sort of AI technology, which I think is used in academia quite a lot, where you can put a academic reference into it, and it will obviously summarize it for you. But the thing that really blew my mind is it created a conversational podcast on that topic. So I put one of my research pieces, because I knew it really well, into this system. And suddenly two people, AI generated obviously, were talking really compellingly about my work in a conversational way. So one was saying, it's really interesting what Martin said about this. Luckily, they were being quite positive about the article. They were saying, it's really interesting when Martin said this. And that just got me thinking, that's incredible. That would be such high spec to create in an assessment center experience. It would cost so much when I first started designing assessment center materials, and now that could be done quite quickly. So suddenly you could, rather than a classic disseminate this information, you've suddenly got the option to present it as a podcast, present it in loads of really interesting different ways, and really engage the candidate. Obviously, we need to think carefully about accessibility, reasonable adjustments, what that means from that side of things. But I think there's a huge amount of potential there. And likewise, I think that the future probably is more of that, not only, and this is what I was getting to with the AI skills, not only getting data from people about, do they get the right answer in a numerical reasoning item, or what do they say about their strengths and preferences in a self-report questionnaire, but ask them why they gave that response, and what they've learned from that, what they do differently. Those sorts of things that we'd be looking for, I think won't be long before we're able to build assessments that don't take too much time to do that, and also score them in an efficient, cost-effective way.
Great. That's all of our questions for now.
Okay. Well, as I say, my details are on the slide. Please do feel free to connect and keep the conversation going. But thank you everyone for joining.